Hi everyone, my name is Cassie and I will be presenting on remote sensing techniques used in the localization of unmarked burials. So for a little bit of introduction, my research question is on a global scale, how do remote sensing techniques that archaeologists are using to find unmarked burials compare and contrast with one another? This paper aims to firstly provide some background context to the remote sensing techniques of GIS and GPR. Secondly, to outline 3 case studies from 3 different places in the world. And thirdly, to compare and contrast the materials and methods used by archaeologists in each case study. So by comparing and contrasting how archaeologists use remote sensing techniques to locate unmarked burials, one can see that GIS and GPR have been favored around the world for their effective and accessible nature. So for a little bit of background context, let's talk about Geographic Information System, which is GIS. The computer system analyzes and shows geographic reference information. Ground penetrating radar, or GPR, is a type of radar that uses impulses of radio waves of a frequency to create a profile of solid materials and underground features. The unmarked burials can be made up of a single individual or of a mass amount of number of people. And detecting unmarked burials allows living group to hopefully gain some closure and to kind of give back to what has happened in the past. So the first case study that I would like to go through is written by Watson, Worth et al. In 2021 in their article Integrating Remote Sensing and Indigenous Archaeology to Locate Unmarked Graves, a case study from Northern Alberta, Canada. So this was brought on because the Chippewa Prairie First Nations requested that an unmarked grave survey was performed at the Cowpar Lake burial ground, which was an unregistered cemetery known through Indigenous knowledge. The author intentionally uses the term Indigenous knowledge instead of traditional knowledge, as they believe that the traditional is seen as being static, whereas hopefully Indigenous allows for more information to be seen as ever evolving. So the unregistered cemetery in question is thought to contain approximately 14 Dedesulane, which are thought to have died from Spanish flu in 1918 to 1919. So the research problem that they're kind of trying to go off of is that the CPFN nation decided that the Cowbar Lake burial ground that has a few visible surface remains should be fenced off so the graves are not impacted, especially with the anticipation of increased highway vehicle traffic. So before fences could be put in, it was important that all graves were identified. And this is where the ground penetrating radar came in. The ground penetrating radar survey came in, which allowed them to delineate the graves and inform fence construction diameters. So for a little bit of geographic context, the traditional territory of this group falls within the Athabasca oil sands region of Alberta, which contains sandy near surface deposits that allows for effective geophysical and GPR research. So the environment is seen as being really connected to this chosen technology. The study focused on ground penetrating radar survey that sought to identify and characterize the burials and define their extent so that a protective fence could be constructed. So for GPR settings and grid orientation, this was a big part of this study. It was really important that it was caught up in detail and everything. So the information that they based off of this research, they actually got from the community members. So that was all traditional knowledge. From there, they decided to make rectilinear grades, survey transected places in order to bisect the expected graves perpendicularly. The area was requested to be surveyed by the community. And that was kind of the area that the full area that they requested was separated into 2 areas. So grid A, which was 18 by 18 meters, was centered over the burial ground, and grid B, which was 7 by 8 meters, was offset to avoid 2 large trees and other obstacles. And this is kind of a way of expanding their survey to confirm that there are no graves that have been missed. So that was really, really important. The survey intersections were done unidirectionally over both grids. Both transects were spaced at 25 centimeter intervals to maintain a resolution that was high enough to detect the same graves in multiple profiles. The readings were lodged at a rate of 50 scans per meter, and samples were set to 1,024, and 3 gain points were set automatically at the beginning of the survey and consistently used throughout the project. Two-way travel time was set to record up to 60 nanometers, which is a conservative estimate, in order to capture graves less than 6 meters deep. So they were taking kind of the depth into play for sure. The two-way travel time was later converted to depth using hyperbole fitting estimation in the GPR viewer, which determined the dialectic permeability to be about 11. So everything was kind of working together. As you can see, they're building on top of one on top of another. The data was processed using GPR viewer from 2006 and GPR process from 2010, which was developed by Dr. Lawrence Conveys and Jeffrey Lucas. The reflection points were time zeroed and a basic background removal filter was applied. These profiles were then time zeroed and so once these profiles were time zeroed and a background removal filter was applied, then the profiles were sliced into 3 NS time slices using GPR processing. So we're still seeing that ground penetrating radar processing doing its part. From there, they used the Golden Software Surfer 19 to construct amplitude maps. And in conclusion, their methodology was kind of based off first finding the graves that were identified in the profile, then those were compared to amplitude maps, and then final conclusions were made. So this is kind of the area. So this is figure 1. So that's where you can see a portion of the traditional territory and the study area that's in focus of where the unmarked grave cemetery is located. Here in figure 5, you can see the GPR, so the ground penetrating profiles from different parts of the study area. The yellow lines that you see there are annotations that indicate that the grave-shaped radar reflections resulting from either wooded, coffin, or straw burials. So that's kind of important. That's where you can physically see it. And they did kind of note in this study that some were buried with more traditional behaviors, whereas others were Roman Catholic. So that would make sense why there was a coffin because of the Roman Catholic influence. The second case study that we are going to that I'm considering is the article Mass Grave Localization Prediction with Geographic Information Systems in Guatemala and Future Impacts by Santinelli et al. From 2011. And the purpose of this study is to explore and analyze existing data collected by FAFG from their previously published investigations in Guatemala in order to examine patterns using QGIS and algorithms within the system to help reduce the size of the area to be searched. This research attempted to determine if predicting the location of mass graves is possible, and if so, whether or not it is possible to determine how many individuals are in the predicted graves. It should really be noted that this project utilized only open data sources and programs to acquire information and widely known analytical processes in geostatistics. The main one that was used for this study was QGIS, which the authors claim to be very user-friendly. But the authors also highlight that the fact that the lack of data that's easily acceptable to open sources formats and access to detailed information on the individual mass graves was the greatest limitation of their research. So while they say it's very user-friendly, they also say that the amount of data there was the biggest limitation. So this restricted the study developing ranges of possible distance and changes in elevation between transportation networks and areas where digging a grave is feasible. So there are clear limitations that they point out in this case study. This research investigated roads, streets, waterways, points of interest, and administrative boundaries as features. They do note that there were quite a few other features that they could have used, such as the information about the soil type that was there, or population densities in the past. However, they chose to focus on these stated that I just mentioned features because of their availability in an open source format and because of their presence on a worldwide basis. So that would allow this research to be replicated in other countries or applied to different situations. Their data acquisition, like we said, came from the FAFG data set. They're dating. So that was the mass grave data set, and that was then converted during the data processing into a shapefile using the GIS add tabular data tool. So the really cool thing about this case study is that the authors were really detailed in what systems and what buttons and filters they were specifically putting. So that was really important. So after the mass grave data set was converted into a shapefile using the GIS add tabular data tool, then the digital elevation map was added as a raster layer, and roads, streets, waterways, points of interest, and administrative boundaries, so again, those features that we're considering, were then added as vector layers. So that was another dimension. From there, they really went into the distance from mass graves to road, streets, and waterways, the distance from mass graves to possible towns, the distance from mass graves to selected points of interest, adding elevation values, and calculating slope and least cost pathways. So that's what we can kind of see here in figure 8. We see a map showing similarity of path and distance in meters of least cost path and road distance to mass graves, which kind of shows that interaction between the mass graves and the features. So that was kind of cool for sure. From there, the analysis was conducted. So the data analysis was conducted. So the gathered information from the QGIS was placed on a CVS file, which was exported and used to perform 3 statistical analysis. So this was made up of the principal component analysis, PCA, discriminant function analysis, DFA, and descriptive analysis, and descriptive analysis, and in SPSS. Before analysis was conducted, normalization of the data was done using a Z-score transformation. And from the results of this study, it is really clear that the numbers of individuals buried is not correlated with the variables examined in this study. The distribution of mass grave sites appears to be random relative to the variable analyzed. So the model used in this research indicates that it cannot be used to predict the location of all mass graves and still covers a relatively large portion of the country of interest. It can be narrow, the predictable model can be used to narrow areas of focus for physical satellite or satellite image search. They also note that open source databases need to be improved to include features such as detailed soil information, vegetation, and tree cover. So that would be the ideal situation. And they didn't use satellite imagery at a high enough resolution because of the high associated cost. So that was their kind of reasoning towards choosing GIS. The third case study that we're going to look at is based off the article Discovery of a Mass Grave from the Spanish Civil War using ground penetrating radar and forensic archaeology, written by Fernando Alvarez et al. This research project was conducted by a group of geophysicists, archaeologists, and forensic scientists who were asked by the Cienfuegos family to locate the grave of their grandfather, who was shot and thought to be buried with 10 other victims in a mass grave located in the Parasim in the mountains of Lina. And so that's in the north of Spain. The authors suggested the best practice is to suggesting a phase approach, moving from large scale remote sensing methods to ground renaissance and control studies before full searches are initiated. So that's kind of the approach that they took on for this. The purpose of the study is to first detail the geoforensic search for an unmarked Spanish Civil War mass graves in the mountain of Asturias in northern Spain, to document the resulting forensic archaeological excavation and to compare results to other mass grave search studies in a similar environment. Sorry, I don't think you're seeing my, okay, sorry, I thought you weren't seeing my whole thing. Okay, there you are. So for the materials and methods, the study area was divided into two areas. So zone A was determined to be more probable based off previous archaeological investigations, while zone B is included because of the oral testaments identifying it as a potential location. In this further geophysical data acquisition, a GPR Mala TM Pro X system was used to collect 2D trial profiles, which is shown here in, oh, sorry, this is the next photo, but those are shown in figure 3 if you would like to look back on the article. While other authors in similar mountainous terrains had determined 250 MHZ frequency antennas to be optimal, the 500 MZX antenna was determined to be optimal here due to the better quality data when compared to the 250, and for data acquisition logistics in which mountainous terrains and steep slopes are kind of better. So that's what their reasoning for that was. The lower frequency antenna has also been suggested for detection by controlled stimulation Cladence grave studies, but the 500 frequency would judge here to be a better compromise between data quality, acquisition time, and successful chance of detection due to adequate resolution. So full GPR survey grids were conducted in both zones, but zone B had no geophysical abnormalities, whereas zone A did. So in zone A, GPR trace samplings on each 2D profile was 2 centimeters apart with automatic stack mode, and a time window of 100 NS was used for all the profiles. Standard surveying methods were employed to ensure sample position accuracy. Once these 2D GPR profiles were acquired, they were downloaded and imported into Reflex WinTM version 6 processing software. So that was really important. And then from here, you can see in figure 4, these are the setup of the transect line versus the GPR profile versus the anomaly versus the excavation. So you can see how those kind of all layer out and the way that it was lined. Here in figure 5, we can see the GPR profiles that were created and kind of that abnormally that shows you right there that there is likely a burial site. So my discussion is threefold. It contains compare, contrast, and ethics. So when we're comparing, we can see, I'm going to talk a little bit about data sources. So open data sources, such as the one that's using Guatemalan and the Albertan case studies, compared to closed and private data sources. I'm also going to talk about the environment. So in Spain and Guatemala, we have, in Spain, we have a mountainous terrain, which complicated logistics, data collection, and the coverage of large areas. In contrast, I want to be talking about the fact that there's no standardized best practice for archaeological studies using remote sensing to detect unmarked burials. The first and third case study both rely on GPR, but suggest different practices and methodologies when it comes to this. When we're talking about ethics, we're talking about the case studies demand that we use ethics and methodology that are sensitive to the specific countries that you are studying. That's going to need to go a little bit more into detail about that, as it really varies from different, but I think there are standardized practices of keeping an open mind and community integration that we can really include as part of every standard practice. So that is where my project's going, is the compare, contrast, and then the consideration of different ethics in remote sensing in the detection of unmarked burial graves seen through 3 case studies. Here are my references cited. Thank you so much for watching, and please send me any feedback or insight you may have my way. Thank you and have a good day.